Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is actually a part 3 of this ongoing series I call UFOs in Your Hometown. I put out a challenge some time ago. Give me a location and I can find encounters there. And guess what? I'm batting 100%. It does appear to be true that UFOs are seen pretty much everywhere on our planet. So what I've picked are 8 locations today. I'm choosing these in order of locations received by you guys, the viewers. And the cases I found do cover pretty much the entire range. So we have close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, face-to-face encounters with humanoids, onboard encounters, the whole deal, all kinds of evidence to support these encounters, cases leading back more than 100 years, all the way up to the present day. So I hope you find this interesting. I sure learned a lot. And the locations I will be covering today include Ealing in London, UK, also Frankfort, Indiana, Warrenton, Missouri, Santa Clarita, California, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Roseville, California, Littleton, Massachusetts, and also Bastrop in Texas. And along with that, right next to Bastrop is Bergstrom Field, Bergstrom Air Base. So some really interesting cases, some I think you probably may have heard of, but most I would be surprised if you had. And wow, some that definitely deserve to be well known because they are amazing. And let's just get started with our first location, which is Ealing in London, UK. This is by special request of Theodorus. Didn't find a whole lot. This is a relatively small section of London, but I found some cases, and I hope you find it interesting, Theodorus, because this is for you. The first case I found from Ealing comes from researcher George Mitrovic in his book Strange and Mysterious Phenomena of Great Britain, Ireland, and Europe, and it does involve a humanoid. This incident occurred way back in 1845. According to numerous witnesses, a humanoid with blazing eyes, wearing a tight-fitting overall, a cloak, and an apparent transparent globe over his head, was seen leaping tall hedges and walls that were way too high for a normal human to jump over. Now, George Mitrovic interpreted this humanoid as possibly being a very fit, athletic madman wearing a bizarre costume, which to me seems a bit of a stretch, but you can certainly make up your own mind about it. It's an interesting case, not a lot of details to it, but the fact is this description of this humanoid is very much congruent with current modern day cases. A much more recent case from 1978 was reported to the Ministry of Defense by a gentleman who said he saw a, quote, gigantic saucer, end quote, which was all lit up with colored lights. And he said it seemed to him as if, quote, I was meant to see this object. This is something that a lot of people who see UFOs have said, so that's certainly interesting. Now, this was shortly after the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released. Not sure that's a significant factor, other than perhaps it prompted him or encouraged him to report his own encounter. A much more recent encounter occurred on September 27, 2015, and was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center the day after it happened. So clearly this impressed the witness, who is anonymous. But September 27 was a lunar eclipse, and this gentleman from Ealing was viewing it when he saw a green boomerang-shaped object. He said it zoomed around 5 or 6 times before finally darting away. He noticed something else, a strange aura or haze around the object, and he also said that while he was viewing this craft, his cat seemed to react to its presence by jumping up onto his lap. A second and very recent case from Norfolk occurred on May 18, 2022. This involves a gentleman from Ealing who says he heard a loud crash coming from outside his home, and he went outside. He didn't see anything, but checking his security camera, he saw what appeared to be a streak of light coming down from the sky into his backyard. He said it looked like it bounced twice and then streaked back upwards. And he said it looked very much like a shooting star, except probably can't be a shooting star given that it bounced around and moved upwards. But since he didn't see it with his own eyes, hard to say what that was. So there you go, Theodorus. Not a whole lot of cases, but there was one involving humanoids, and that's certainly an interesting case. But just goes to show, again, UFOs and ETs are seen everywhere. And we now move to our next location. This is by special request of Steve Casper, who asked me to look into the area of Frankfort, Indiana. And I found some amazing cases. No cases really of humanoids, but while one case I found is really interesting, and you could call this just a sighting, but man oh man, it's such an amazing case, it deserves to be really well known. Most of the early cases I found in Frankfurt are quite brief. Here's one which occurred in 1953, exact date unknown, but apparently a group of people saw two disc-shaped objects hovering overhead. They appeared to be white in color until the sun shone directly on them, and they tilted in the air, at which point these discs appeared to be silvery. That's the first case, but certainly not the last. It was 3 years later, 9:30 p.m. on October 4, 1956, when two men, George Sihler and Dave King, were out hunting in the woods about 6 miles northwest of Frankfurt, and they said that they both saw this weird boat-shaped object kind of float lazily into view just over the treetops. And as it moved off into the distance, it faded away, but it was immediately followed by, get this, 5 other identical-looking objects, all traveling west to east towards Frankfurt. And like the first object, these other 5 were silent, luminous, and faded away as they moved off into the distance. A pretty simple and standard UFO sighting. And here's another one. July of 1956. Clarence Greenough said he saw a, quote, very bright object, which looked like a ball of silver, a silvery sphere, and it moved very slowly, but was quite high in the sky, he said. There was some speculation that this might have been a satellite, but it was just 3 months later, further events occurred, which provide another possible answer to what's going on in Frankfurt. And this is probably the most amazing case that I found in the Frankfurt area. This occurred to the crew of a diesel freight train number 91. It has a regular route between Monon, Indiana, and Indianapolis. And on October 3rd, 1958, they were traveling south from Monon towards Indianapolis with a train of 56 cars. Now this crew included at least 5 men. We know who they are. Engineer Harry Ekman, Fireman Cecil Bridge, Head Brakeman Morris Ott, Conductor Edward Robinson, and the flagman Paul Sosby. It was 3:20 a.m. again on October 3rd, 1958, and it was near Owasco that something very strange happened. Fireman Cecil Bridge saw them first, a group of 4 star-like lights moving in a sort of rough V formation. And he watched them for about 15 seconds and realizing that they were quite strange, immediately started to alert the rest of the crew. And as they all watched, these lights veered to the west and crossed the tracks ahead of them about a half-mile ahead. As Cecil Bridge says in his own words, they were moving pretty slowly too, at not more than about 50 miles an hour. 4 big, white soft lights. After the lights crossed the tracks in front of us, they stopped and came back. Now there was some speculation that they actually landed on the tracks. They're really not sure about this, but the objects darted off and a few minutes later came back again. Conductor Edward Robinson was sitting in the caboose of the train and he got a real close look at them. As he says in his own words, all of a sudden they came back. This time they came down over the train, a little way in back of the engine. They were coming towards the caboose. That is, they were going north, and the train was heading directly south. I'd say they were only a couple of 100 feet above the train as they came towards the caboose. Now, Fireman Cecil Bridge, of course, witnessed this, and as he says, they flew over us, one after another, big round white things that looked about the color of fluorescent lights, kind of fuzzy around the edges. They didn't glare, and they didn't light up things as they went over. They just came back towards us over the top of the cars, one after the other. Then they went on down the tracks maybe another half a mile and seemed to stop. Now, after stopping, these objects darted very fast to the east, at which point they changed from bright white to yellow and then to a darkish orange. And as Edward Robinson says, they must have circled the train and gone north of us, real low, because the next time we saw them, they came rushing up the tracks right in back of us. They were coming a lot faster this time, a lot faster than they had come back over the train the first time. They were just above the treetops, along the right-of-way. They were flying on edge. We could see that they were round things, circular shaped on the bottom. They were about 40 feet in diameter and maybe 10 feet thick. So these objects are pacing this train for quite some time, and they continued to do so as this train went right through Frankfort towards Kirkland, and turns out that there were several flashlights in the caboose. So two of the crewmen, Edward Robinson and Cecil Bridge, decided to get those flashlights and flash them at the UFOs. And this is when things became even more interesting. As Cecil Bridge says, "We blinked our flashlight at the things, and we waved the lights. We thought we might get them to come in closer. They did come down over the train a few minutes later." As Edward Robinson describes this, "When the things came down and flew right up the tracks behind the caboose, I grabbed that sealed beam flashlight and shined it on them. As soon as the light hit them, they jumped sideways out of the beam. When they got back over the tracks, I did it again, and they scattered. They acted like they didn't care for that light at all." From the time Bridge first called us on the radio until the last time we saw them near Kirkland, it was about an hour and 10 minutes. They hung around the back end of the train, but after we shined the light on them, they didn't come in close anymore. While we were switching at Frankfort, they stayed away back up the tracks, just hovered there until we moved on. Then they followed us again. When they finally went away at Kirkland, they just zipped off to the northeast and kept on going, and we didn't see them anymore. So yeah, these UFOs followed that train for over an hour. After they were gone, after all of this occurred, the crew discussed the sighting and, afraid of ridicule and disbelief, decided not to report the experience to the Air Force, who they knew were basically ridiculing and trying to cover this subject up. But they did contact NICAP, the National Investigative Committee for Aerial Phenomenon, and got in touch with Frank Edwards, researcher and radio host, who interviewed each of them firsthand. But as Edward Robinson says, "It was the most fantastic thing I ever saw. If somebody else reported it, I would think they were crazy." Now there's still a lot of activity over Frankfort because it was just 2 months later that Miss Irene Thomas saw something very similar. She was at her home on 457 Jefferson Street at 5:30 p.m. on December 4, 1958, when she saw what she described as an orange-colored object moving to the west. She called the local newspapers, and a reporter was intrigued enough to drive down to the west edge of the city, and get this, he saw not one but 2 objects, which he says were flying very quickly. And as he watched, the leading object stopped, climbed straight up, reversed direction, and darted off to the northwest. The object behind it stopped in midair, turned from orange to white, and disappeared. Sounds very much like what the crew of the diesel train saw. And sightings continued. It was on July 27, 1966 that a Frankfort resident said that he saw a mysterious light approach as close as 500 feet away from him. He said it was totally silent. That's all the information I have on that case, but there's case after case in Frankfort. Frankfort really delivered. On August 23rd, 1977, 4 witnesses, including Emily Kearns, Jim Waters, and Mr. and Miss Al Becker, they were driving about 8 miles north of Frankfort when they said an object zoomed towards their car and then began to follow about 500 feet behind it. They stopped the car, at which point the object veered off to the north, but they said it was close enough that they could hear a humming sound coming from it. 4 years later, July 6, 1981, numerous people called the Frankfurt police to report an object which hovered for no less than 5 hours, from about 10 p.m. until almost 3 a.m. Many of the witnesses were actually deputies themselves. They watched this object. Police dispatcher Ron Gunther said, and I quote, "It moved around in circles and then back and forth. And when it was done playing games, it just went straight up in the air and out of sight." One of the witnesses, Randy Arnold, watched it from his home, 852 Myrtle Avenue, watched it for hours. He said this object appeared to be spinning and flashing lights. As he says, it's pretty crazy. It sounds pretty crazy too. You get to wondering if somebody is pulling a joke. Now, there was some speculation that this could have been a balloon, but this was quickly ruled out. None of the witnesses really thought this, but people were trying to explain it away. And the fact is, this object remained in place for far too long for it to be a balloon. Its movement was defying the wind currents. Its description did not match a balloon. And besides, 1 month later, on August 19, 1981, it was back. More calls came to the sheriff's office, with one witness describing it as this object being covered with red, white, and sort of blue-green flashing lights all over it. He said it looked like, quote, a building standing upright. One witness, Wesley Thomas, said he saw this object hovering directly over the 600 block of Kiger Street. Sheriff's Deputy Tom Catron watched this object for 3 hours as it moved slowly overhead. He was one of about 8 other police officers watching this object. In fact, Police Chief Paul Underwood said, "They saw something, but they don't know what it was, and nobody else seems to know." And that's pretty much it for Frankfort, though I will say it was just 2 days later that the town of Hamilton in the northeast corner of the state had a huge wave of sightings. In fact, police received at least 93 calls in the space of 2 hours. Can you imagine? Talk about the phones ringing off the hook. This got a huge amount of press coverage. And I'm sure there are plenty of other Frankfurt cases out there, but those were certainly the most interesting. There you go, Steve. I have to say, Frankfort, Indiana really did deliver some truly astonishing cases. I especially found that one involving the train super interesting. Seems to me this is another example of UFOs putting on a display, wanting people to see them, announcing their presence. That's certainly what it looks like. But an amazing case, whatever the motive was. And now we move to our next location, which again was requested by Steve Casper. So it's 2 for the price of 1, Steve. And you asked me to look into Warrenton, Missouri. And I found some cases, not a whole lot, but enough to prove my theory that yes, UFOs are seen everywhere on this planet. So I hope you find these 3 cases interesting. I'm sure there's more out there, but these 3 are enough to prove that UFOs are visiting every location on our planet. The first of 3 cases I found in Warrenton, one occurred in November of 1969. The main witness is Leonard Rifkin. He's a technical illustrator for McDonnell Aircraft. I did confirm his employment, and he was out deer hunting in a field just off Highway 70 near Warrenton. It was 5:30 a.m. when he says he saw this strange glowing object appear on the western horizon. And he started watching it, and as it moved overhead, it suddenly made a sharp 90-degree turn towards the north. That's not something a plane or helicopter or a balloon can do. And as if to sort of put the nail in the coffin, it made 3 more sharp angle turns and then disappeared to the south over the woods. Also, this object was totally silent the whole time. There were 2 cases reported to the National UFO Reporting Center. More than that, but these are the most interesting ones. It was around midnight on December 12, 1996, when a married couple was driving along the I-70 very near Warrenton when they noticed a bright light ahead of them. It was about 1,000 feet up over an overpass, so very low. And as they drove under it, they could see what looked like 4 little triangular formations on the bottom. As they drove on, this object moved off, but shortly later they saw this weird red orb bouncing up and down. And this was one of many sightings by the witness over a number of years. But he says this was one of his most interesting. A second and more recent sighting occurred on the evening of October 5, 2019. The witness stepped outside her home in Warrenton to look at the stars and saw this weird, huge, kind of misty cloud-like object, which was moving pretty fast for a cloud at about 30 miles per hour, and it was just above the tree line and heading towards her house. As she says, I looked closer and noticed it was a solid object, emitting smoke all over it, as if it were trying to be a cloud. It was totally silent. Seeing how weird it was, she immediately called out to her husband, "What is that?" And he came to look, and they both watched this thing as it made a hard left turn, moving towards the east. She became frightened at this point and ran inside, but her husband stayed outside and watched this thing move behind their house, at which point it was close enough that he could make out a dark, sort of charcoal gray, chevron-shaped object hidden inside this misty cloud. And as the witness says, we both lost sleep over this that night and spent hours researching what we saw. So that's Warrenton, Missouri. And definitely, as you can see, ETs are aware of it. They're showing themselves everywhere. Mostly just sightings, but don't worry, I do have some humanoid cases coming up, some onboard cases, photographic cases. It's really amazing stuff in this episode. And the next location I'd like to cover is Santa Clarita, California. I actually got a couple of requests for this location from Steve, Chris, and Christina. And yeah, Santa Clarita delivered with an especially astonishing case, very close-up encounter of a UFO hovering over someone's home. Just found a couple of cases, but I will say I did cover an earlier case in Santa Clarita in my episode, If You Call Them, They Will Come. I checked that one out. It's a truly amazing case involving an onboard experience, a very close-up, very extensive encounter involving a lady by the name of Geneva Sterling, who basically called out for help to the universe and a UFO showed up. So yeah, check that out. But definitely found some other cases, and one, amazing. All the cases in this episode, I have to tell you, this one to me is one of the most interesting. How it's just a fascinating case. It did appear in Albert Rosalli's book. Michael Schratt investigated this as well. This was reported by the witness to numerous UFO organizations. The witnesses are Ed Towers and his wife Gloria. Ed Towers is a great witness. He's an aeronautical engineer. He served as an executive for major aircraft companies, so he knows aircraft. And it was 9 p.m. on July 13, 1979, when they had this amazing encounter. Ed was in the backyard of his Santa Clarita home and was cleaning the pool. Suddenly he noticed this strange craft approaching from about 2, maybe 1 block away. And it was flying very low, and he could see immediately that this was not normal. It had strange lights all around the circumference. And as Ed says, it was immediately obvious to me that the craft was not a helicopter nor airplane. Now he called out to his wife Gloria and their kids. The kids did not come out, but his wife Gloria did. just in time to see this thing approach and come right over their house. As Ed says in his own words, "By that time, the craft was right over our pool area at an altitude of no more than 50 to 75 feet, and perhaps even less. The craft had come to a stop in proximity to our pool area as we stood below it. The craft made no sound whatsoever. It wobbled slightly as if it were moved by the wind, but there was no noticeable wind at that moment. The craft leaned forward and downwards, and then we saw a large forward-angled window. We could see an orange-bluish glow from inside, but no occupants or controls. The craft seemed to be manufactured as one solid piece. There were no visible seams or rivets. Now we did notice that the bottom was concave. It had two weird rectangular protrusions of some kind. It did have an upper dome with what looked like portholes, but no markings, no insignia. It was quite large, about 50 to 75 feet wide, about the size of a large house. And Gloria, the wife, was awed by the sight, and she kept saying over and over again, "Oh my God." Now Ed, at this point, spoke telepathically, mentally out to them, and said, quote, "Take me with you." They apparently did not, because this was just a sighting. Now, as Ed says, we were both frozen in awe and disbelief. It was like seeing a large bus floating over your house. He said that they had no fear, but were absolutely awestruck. They didn't speak or look at each other during the whole time. They just stared at this craft. Both had the sensation of being watched, especially because of the way the craft was tilted forward, as if to look at them. And this standoff went on for about 45 seconds, at which point the craft moved off at about 20 miles per hour. And as Ed says, my conclusion is that the craft wanted us to observe it, or perhaps it was examining us. I am 100% sure this was not a man-made craft or technology. They did report their sighting to the police, who said that they had not received any other calls. Now here's an interesting part of this case. According to Albert Rosales, as the craft moved off, they did see two humanoid forms, dressed in black up to the neck, but they could not make out any facial details. Now this report of humanoids does not appear in their original report, so I'm not sure. Rosales says he got this information directly from them, and perhaps there was some amnesia elements going on here. This sort of thing has turned up in other cases where people don't initially report or remember seeing humanoids. So either way, it's a truly incredible sighting. And I looked for other cases, and Norfolk does have a few dozen reports. These are almost exclusively anomalous lights, either hovering or darting around or quite distant. But one impressive report of a solid craft occurred on June 13, 2005. By synchronicity, it was again while people were standing next to their pool. 4 adults and 3 children were out swimming in the neighbor's pool when they saw this very large boomerang-shaped object. They said it had 7 to 8 small blinking red lights along the edge. It made a soft engine noise, and as it moved off, a fighter jet appeared flying behind it, and it looked almost to the witnesses as if it was escorting it. And that made them wonder if this might in fact be an advanced military craft of some kind. It's important to note that Edwards Air Force Base is located only about 50 miles to the north. Edwards, of course, is an airbase where all kinds of, quote, reverse engineering is going on. So that could be what's going on here. Not everything in the sky is necessarily ET. So there you go, Steve, Chris, and Christina. There are UFOs over Santa Clarita. And boy, that case involving the gentleman by the name of Ed Towers and his wife, can only imagine what it must have been like to see a UFO that close, hovering right over their house. Amazing. A really well documented case. And I think it says a lot about why ETs are here. think it's one of their main goals, really, is to simply announce their presence. And they sure are doing this in a way that's absolutely undeniable. And now we move to our next location, which was by special request of Kim, and that is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And of all the locations, Milwaukee definitely delivered a huge variety of cases, not only sightings, but humanoids, an onboard case, a really interesting photographic case as well, and cases going all the way back to the 1800s to pretty much the current day. So I think you will find this very interesting. And again, I sure learned some new things just doing the research in these various locations. As it turns out, Milwaukee is part of the amazing airship wave of 1896. One of the first sightings occurred on April 12th, as the janitor at the Central Police Station in Milwaukee says that he saw a strange, quote, machine hovering only 1,000 feet above Milwaukee City Hall. He said it was oval in shape. But the big sighting occurred on December 6, 1896. One of the witnesses was millionaire Herbert Nunnemacher, and he was at the Pfister Hotel in Milwaukee when he saw an object floating over the bay against the wind. He grabbed his field glasses and saw what appeared to be a male figure inside it. At this point he ran outside to get a better look, but it was gone. Going back inside, 10 minutes later, he saw it again. Apparently there were quite a few witnesses to this, hundreds, in Milwaukee. This was part of the mysterious airship wave of the late 1890s, which has yet to be explained. The sightings continued. In April 1952, witnesses observed a group of 5 disc-shaped objects move over the city. Unfortunately, no other details. But 1952 was a big year because on July 27, 1952, 3 Milwaukee Civil Patrol employees, good witnesses, saw a silvery sphere up in the sky at about 2,000 feet elevation, not very high. One of the witnesses, Clayton Feldman, said, and I quote, "I realized it was metal because it glinted in the sun." They were driving and they said it moved along with them as they drove about 10 miles west of Milwaukee. And it was just 1 month later when policemen and firemen watched an object hovering in the sky for over 90 minutes. This was the night of August 31, 1952. One of the witnesses was Fire Captain Bernard Goick, and he said this object, quote, wavered in one location, but not steady, with varied colored lights that kept going on and off. Police Sergeant Rudy Messer and other policemen and firemen watched this object and said it was disc-shaped and that it had red, green, blue, yellow, and white lights, all lit up like a Christmas tree. Now, a weather balloon had been released the previous night, but it was ruled out as the cause of this sighting because this weather balloon had been seen moving out over Lake Michigan and disappeared long before this UFO was seen. And reportedly, many other witnesses called the police to report sightings on that same night. Here's another really interesting close-up sighting of a solid disk, which was reported by Donald E. Heffernan to the Center of UFO Studies. He says that in the spring of 1962, he stepped outside of his Milwaukee home and was confronted by a very close-up, disc-shaped object. He says that, quote, this object approached from my left side, within 10 feet. I can only describe it as a round, web-like, transparent object. Its lines were intricate beyond belief. I looked at it, and it came closer. I never took my eyes off of it. It began to move towards the area in front of me. It moved very slowly until it was out of sight. Some time after this incident, I was looking at a UFO magazine, and there was a picture of a group of men at a UFO meeting. Behind these men, there was a bulletin board with pictures, and one picture was a crude attempt to draw the same object I saw that night in Milwaukee. This is no disrespect to the artist, but I believe it would be impossible to copy its delicate lines. Another sighting occurred at 1:45 a.m. on August 3, 1962. The witnesses were Herb Thrun and his wife, and they observed a brilliant light zoom over their house from south to north. They live about 10 miles south of Mitchell Air Force Base. They said this object appeared to be revolving, and as it came overhead, they could see more detail. It looked almost cigar-shaped, golden orange in color, totally silent, and as soon as it was right over their heads, they saw a, quote, huge sunflower-shaped light. This began to blink on and off, and then the object moved in sort of a flat course towards the Miller Brewing Company. Maybe they went to check out that. I don't know. Now here's a case involving humanoids. It's quite brief, but it occurred at 4:30 a.m. on August 1st, 1976. The witness, identified only by her initials LVK, she's 20 years old, heard this strange noise outside her home, looked out the window, and says that she saw two humanoid figures. They were of normal height. She was unable to see the details of their faces, but it was strange because as soon as she looked at them, she saw a beam of light come out from them towards the east, and she also heard them talking in a weird, unintelligible foreign language. Unfortunately, there are no other details to this case. 3 years later, on August 5, 1979, the guy was driving 20 miles north of Milwaukee when he said he saw 5 large red lights in a V formation. They quickly moved downward and to the right ahead of him, vanishing as they moved towards the horizon. He says they did move slowly, but they were obvious enough that he was surprised to see that the other traffic on the highway did not appear to react or even see them at all. A simple sighting, but definitely interesting. And here's another one that same year. In fact, less than 1 month later, 8:30 p.m., September 2nd, 1979, Bruce Suvuzga and Randall Froschuser were driving eastbound on Drexel Boulevard. This is off of Pennsylvania Avenue, when they said they saw this weird glowing dome-shaped object hovering over some trees. Now Bruce said it was, quote, very bright orange in color, glowing with different shades of orange. He said this would sort of glow and fade, and as they got closer to it, the object seemed to actually get smaller and it finally just disappeared. They did report it to the police, who told them that they had in fact received at least 3 other recent reports of objects in the area. Now here is an onboard encounter in Milwaukee, which comes from respected researcher Wendell Stevens. It was February 1980 when an anonymous attorney woke up in the middle of the night to see a bright light illuminating the interior of his house. He went out onto the patio to investigate and was shocked to see a disc-shaped object hovering only about 50 feet up in the air. And he's looking at this thing, and the next thing he knows, he's inside of it. He said he was greeted by human-looking people who he says told him that they had come from the Pleiades. They took him to a screen which showed the interior of his house. He asked them about time travel, and something very strange happened. They showed him an image of his property long before his house had even been built. This freaked him out a little bit, but they proceeded to show him more images of the surrounding area where he lived long before his house was built. Next thing he knows, he's back on his patio watching this craft depart. He turned to go back inside his house, and this is when he realized he was locked out. He had left the doors open. So he had to get back inside, and the next morning his daughter phoned to say that she had stopped by their house that night, found the patio doors wide open, and had closed them. Certainly an interesting case. And here's another. Also that year, 1980, it was at 4:45 p.m. on August 3rd that 6-year-old Tiffany Gardish was outside of her home located at 1711 Monroe Avenue, and she came running inside to tell her mother Shirley that she had just seen a UFO. Now her mother Shirley thought that her child must be imagining things, but Tiffany was excited, so Shirley had Tiffany draw what she had seen. And looking at these pictures, they showed a detailed, solid object, which really impressed Shirley, so she called the police. The police showed little interest, so she called the local airport, General Mitchell Field, who had no comment. So then she called the South Milwaukee Voice-Journal, who printed a small article about the case. And here's another one, more recent, very brief, but certainly impressive. It's about a report of an anomalous light. This occurred at 3:45 p.m. on June 14, 1997, when a gentleman known only as William H. and his friend Julie were sitting on the porch of a friend's home in Milwaukee. Julie suddenly called out, "Oh my God, look at that!" And as William says, "At that point, we both sprang from our chairs and stared at an erratic, bright yellow-orange light doing crazy spirals. And then it slowed down a little and dropped out of the sky. What I want to know is if anybody else witnessed what we saw." I suspect somebody did, but they just didn't report it because it's very rare that a person reports their sighting. Here's another real recent case, which comes from MUFON. This occurred at 1:54 p.m., July 23rd, 2022. A witness was at the Milwaukee Air and Water Show, and he was using his iPhone to film a jet refueling operation. Now, he didn't see anything at the time he took this photo, which you can see here, but upon reviewing it, he did see something strange in it. A snapshot of this video shows what appears to be a solid saucer-shaped object, which must have moved much faster than a jet. This was actually a video taken. This is just a snapshot of the video. But the investigator who looked into this case came away with declaring this an unidentified object. There you go, Kim. Thank you for requesting Milwaukee. Certainly interesting. I have to say I do love those humanoid cases, those onboard cases the most. But as we can see, even these sightings are sometimes super interesting. And it shows that a lot is going on here that we don't fully understand. I suspect quite a few of these sightings are someone else's onboard experience, that they're coming down and picking somebody up. I can't prove it, but I've seen this pattern in other cases. So that could be what's going on here in a bunch of these, what we would call close encounters of the first kind, simple sightings. But every single case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. Each case is important, and even a simple sighting can absolutely change a person's worldview. And we're certainly seeing that in these cases here. And now we move to the next location, which is by a special request of Kay. Kay suggested I take a look into Roseville, California, and I did. And no surprise, I found some really interesting cases, some sightings, an on-board encounter, a really interesting photographic case. So yeah, thank you, Kay. Found out some really interesting stuff about Roseville. One of the first cases I found in Roseville occurred on July 15, 1970, when a witness reported his sighting of a disc-shaped craft to New Fork. He said it was big, 150 feet wide, 50 feet thick, had a band of lights rotating around the perimeter, and he saw it hovering just at treetop level, very near the Roseville High School, only about 200 feet away from him. In fact, he and his friends watched it for about 2 minutes, until it zoomed up and away and disappeared among the stars. One of them decided to call the police, who said that they had in fact received other reports of UFOs from the surrounding areas. Next report is 5 years later, March 1st, 1975, when a 15-year-old witness and her 18-year-old boyfriend and 2 others were driving near Roseville, and all 4 of them saw a flying disc. They said a dome on top, portholes in the dome, your classic flying saucer. It hovered for 1 minute. It was about 1/3 a mile ahead of them, less than 50 feet up, so they got a pretty good look at it, even though this was a very brief sighting. Next case occurred at 12:15 p.m., August 26, 2001, when a man and wife were driving west on Pleasant Grove Boulevard, approaching Washington Boulevard, when they saw 6 oval-shaped objects, totally silent, making fantastic maneuvers which absolutely ruled out any normal conventional aircraft. These objects were darting, circling, hovering, And here's where it gets super interesting, because these objects were really hard to see, as they almost perfectly matched the background of the sky. But when the wife put her sunglasses on, she said that they were, quote, very discernible. This kind of reminds me of the movie They Live by John Carpenter. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but you can only see the aliens if you put on the sunglasses. So that's interesting there. Perhaps these objects in some way were emitting some field of energy that was much more visible through the sunglasses. Now here's a report of an onboard experience, which occurred on May 5, 2004, when a lady woke up to find herself walking barefoot outside her home in Roseville. She said she was being led somewhere by a small figure towards a wooden fence. She couldn't see this figure. She felt like she was just cooperative. There was no fear involved. And she said she was led to a sort of metal ladder type device and climbed up into it, into a very small, 8-foot wide room with smooth metal walls and a bench around the perimeter of the room. She did see another man and woman sitting on the bench. She saw a round porthole, and she stood up and looked out of it. And she was shocked to see the scenery outside was moving and wobbling, because the inside of the craft she did not feel any movement. But she's looking at this and saw that they were approaching an overpass quite quickly, and this freaked her out, so she screamed out a warning, and she heard a telepathic voice saying in her head, "Quiet that one down." Now, the next thing she knew, it was morning and she was in bed. Again, she felt no fear during this whole experience, and afterwards didn't think about it, kind of went out of her mind. But she did recall it and later wondered if this might have been a dream. So she also wondered if she had been taken on board a craft, and that's what prompted her to report this to Newfork. She told nobody else, not even her husband. Now here's a recent and very impressive sighting. This was at 4:14 a.m. on April 8, 2016, as a highway patrol officer left his job in Roseville. And as he's going away, he says, quote, "A giant black triangular object descended from the clouds with 3 bright white lights, like lights that would light up a stadium, abruptly turned, came about 30 feet and hovered directly above me, and then disappeared into the dark morning sky. The object was gigantic, at least 10 times bigger than a 747 jumbo jet. It had 3 bright white lights at each end and a big red light in the middle. The object was completely silent, not a sound, dark black and solid. The triangular object was gigantic, and it frightened me." Now this sounds to me a lot like a TR-3B, reverse engineered. I wasn't there, of course I can't say for sure, but the officer says he checked the radar in his cruiser, saw nothing unusual. Said this object hovered for about 1 minute before disappearing, and then 2 minutes later, a black military helicopter began to circle the area, clearly looking for this object. And as a police officer, he noted that this was not a police helicopter. This was an unmarked black military helicopter of some kind. Final case from Roseville actually turns out to be a photographic case. This occurred on May 1st, 2022, when a woman woke up at around 4:30 a.m. and noticed 2 very bright golden orbs outside her window. She thought that was strange, so she vowed to check back, and she woke up an hour later, 5:30 a.m., and they were still there, although they looked even closer, slightly higher in the sky, so she snapped a photograph of them. She checked again at 6:30 and they were gone. Now she was facing northeast. She did notice one other detail. There appeared to be an aura or haze around them. So perhaps these were stars or planets under very clear conditions. You can make up your own mind about it. Here's the photograph, but certainly an interesting case. There you go, Kay. Roseville definitely does have UFO activity, quite a variety of it. Super interesting. I'm always surprised to find how many cases do involve multiple witnesses. I always love it when a witness is a trained observer, like a police officer. I think that raises the level of credibility of a case. But fascinating stuff. So much UFO activity. Wherever you look, I'm telling you, there's a history of UFOs. And the next location is Show Low, Arizona. And this is by special request of Greg. I did find just a few cases. It's not a huge place, but I will tell you one of these cases is a really impressive humanoid case and so unusual. I definitely think you'll find it fascinating. This very interesting encounter involves a type of ET, a description of an ET that I'm not sure I've ever heard before. It was after seeing Peter Jennings' report about UFOs on television that the witness decided to come forward with her story. And I'll just quote her directly. As she says, "In the summer of 1988, my then husband and our children set out to a law enforcement track meet in Show Low, Arizona. My husband was a deputy and was on the track team. After the meet, we rented a room at a local two-story motel. Our room was upstairs and sort of in the middle of the building. That evening we were all in bed and asleep by midnight. My 3 children slept on the bed that was closest to the door, and my husband and I slept on the bed next to them, with me being on the west side of the bed. Sometime in those early hours, I awoke to see 2 large-sized alien men walk through the wall, coming from the room just south of ours. They walked through the wall, through the dresser, and the television as they approached the foot of our bed. They stopped and looked at me. By this time I was totally paralyzed and terrified. I could not scream, move, or alert my husband in any way. I feared for our lives, and especially my children. As these beings stood there watching me and my family, I could see that they both had to be at least 6 feet 5 inches or taller. They were very muscular, but yet very lean, no body fat, and both were wearing body armor. Now, strangest of all was the way their faces looked, because as the witness says, I noticed their color. One was a bluish gray, and the other was a reddish gray color. These 2 also had a face like a horse. Their mouth and nose came out just like a horse or a dog. As I looked at the one that was reddish gray, he looked at me and mentally told me, "It's okay, we're just passing through," after which time I think I passed out. Now the witness reports that she blocked the incident from her conscious mind for some time, didn't remember it in fact for many years. She never told her husband or her children. And here's another very interesting case which occurred around 10 p.m. 1996. A lady was in her home. This is in the small town of Concho in rural Apache County, just about 23 miles east of Show Low, so I included it here. She was entertaining 3 guests when one of them jumped up, shouted an expletive, and said, "Did you see that?" He excitedly explained that he had just seen a UFO, apparently on fire, streak downward across the sky, looking like it was coming in for a crash landing. Now another guest said that she also saw this same object, confirmed the exact same details, so all 4 of them ran outside and decided to go drive off in a Jeep towards where they had seen this object go down. And after crossing Highway 61, they came upon an elderly couple who had also parked along the highway and were staring off into this field. So they stopped, and the couple asked them if they had seen the UFO crash. They told them that they were driving west down Highway 61 when they actually saw this object come down, and they pointed to the area where they saw it go down. So, for the next hour, the witnesses continued towards this site via an old cattle trail until they came upon a deep canyon. They couldn't go any further, but at the bottom of this canyon, to their amazement, was apparently this crashed UFO. As the owner of the house says, quote, "It was an oblong egg shape. The color was strange. It was the color of a Caucasian skin with a fading tan, and it faintly glowed." He said this object appeared to have what looked like 2 pillars side by side as though framing a doorway. It was about 50 feet across. There was a pickup truck near the object, and a helicopter landed nearby. They watched it for a while, but there was no visible activity, so they decided to return home. Now, the witness does report that she has seen UFOs before, but had always been alone, and that this was her first sighting with other witnesses. There you go, Greg. Show low definitely showed up. And how about that last case? Landing or a possible even UFO crash retrieval? Hard to say for sure. Don't have a whole lot of information about it, but definitely fascinating. Now let's move to our next location, which is by special request of Jeff. Jeff, you asked me to look into Littleton, Massachusetts, and I'm glad you did. And while I found mostly only sightings, some of these were so interesting. So I hope you find it interesting too. The first Littleton case I could find occurred at 3 p.m. on July 5, 1954, to a 16-year-old girl by the name of Judy Ballore. She was at summer camp in Littleton and was laying out on the lawn when she saw this spherical-shaped object, quite large, about the quarter size of a full moon. It was moving silently across the sky from north to south just beneath the clouds. Now there was no visible wind, or she couldn't feel any wind, the clouds were still, so this did not appear to her to be a balloon of any kind. Furthermore, she described seeing this Saturn-like ring on the lower section of the object, almost at the base of it. She reported the encounter to the police. They refused to take the sighting seriously, but the newspaper did take the report and wrote it up in the next issue. A really interesting case was investigated by researcher Raymond Fowler. It was one evening in autumn of 1964 when there were two teenagers, James Gates and John Thibault, and their 12-year-old friend Norman G. Sheldrick. They were driving through Littleton when they saw this strange object hovering over an area known as the Common. This object, they said, was silver gray, about 100 feet wide, oval in shape. It had two reddish pulsating lights on either side and one in the middle. And it was moving along, so they chased it in their car for a few miles outside of the city to Porter Field. And at this point, they got to about within 500 feet of it, close enough that they could hear it making a, quote, soft roaring sound. They said when it moved with this strange, quote, fluttering motion. So at this point, they got out of their car to walk up to it when it suddenly sped away over the treetops and was gone. But later, Raymond Fowler did locate a fourth witness, a 14-year-old by the name of John Marancino. Turns out his bedroom window overlooked Porter Field, where the others had seen this object. And he saw it too. He looked outside his window, saw apparently the same object. He said it was hovering about 200 feet above the ground. He watched it for about a minute before it darted off. So pretty good confirmation on that sighting. The next one occurred about a half hour after midnight on August 13, 1982. Two friends were driving south on 495 near Littleton when they noticed an unusually large light in the sky, which appeared to be moving towards them. So as it moved over their car and out of view, they decided to stop the car to get a better look. And as they did, this is when they noticed something strange. The whole area was, quote, extraordinarily, strangely quiet. They noticed that all the traffic, which had been there, was now suddenly gone. This object was directly overhead. They disagreed a little bit on the shape of it, whether it was rectangular or diamond-shaped, but it was covered with lights around the perimeter, quite low. They couldn't say exactly how low it was, but they're estimating about 400 feet above them, nearly the size of a football field, totally silent. They watched it for 20 seconds when it moved off slowly, a short distance, and then suddenly darted away at, quote, impossible speed. As the witness says, we were left stunned. One of the most amazing parts of the experience was that I felt no real desire to speak to anyone about it the next day or thereafter. My friend told me he felt the same way. So he didn't report it until 19 years later when he reported it to the National UFO Reporting Center. But that does sound like a genuine encounter with that weird Oz effect, the desire not to talk about it, the way this craft was covered with lights. And here's another, much more recent, November 11, 2015. It was 5:15 p.m. as three people saw this strange object. and it came right over the Littleton police station. They watched this. Now the sun was still shining at this point, but they could see that this object was glowing internally, oval-shaped, and had a bright metallic blue band glowing around it. Totally silent, they said it moved very fast. They saw it zip ahead in maybe about a matter of 3 seconds. It came down low, right above the tree line. And as it was going to land, and it looked like it was actually going to crash, they thought, when something very unusual happened. This object appeared to split into 3 separate, equal-sized, oval-shaped objects, which continued to glide along the tree line and then suddenly moved off so fast they weren't sure if they disappeared or darted away. All right, Jeff, there you go. As you can see, there are sightings over Littleton. That one over the police station was particularly impressive. It's not every day you hear about a UFO flying that low right over a police station. I always wonder what these UFOs are up to, but I think if we gather enough cases, enough evidence, we'll eventually figure it all out. I certainly hope so. It's one of the reasons I do this research. I know a lot of you out there are having encounters. And now we go to our last and final location in this episode of UFOs Over Your Hometown. And this one is by special request of the Coon. And the Coon, I gave you cuts in line because you donated a super sticker donation. So thank you so much. I think it definitely warrants a cut in line. And don't worry, you guys, for all of you who are still waiting, I'm going down this list as fast as I can. I am going to be putting out more episodes. But the Coon, you asked me to look into Bastrop, Texas, and into Bergstrom Field, Bergstrom Air Base. Found some really cool cases. This is a tiny little town, and I was surprised to find that many there. So thank you, and I hope you find this interesting. First case I could find occurred at 4:30 p.m. on July 8, 1947. This is right almost at the same time as the Roswell UFO crash. The main witness is Sergeant C.F. Clifton. He's a Bergstrom Field radio man, and he was taking off in a plane when he and his crew saw a classic round flying saucer. As Sergeant Clifton says, I think it was about 18 feet in diameter, and it looked as though it was made of glass. It was extremely bright and kept flashing. The disc seemed to be spinning as it flew. It blurred radio reception slightly. So it was flying fast. In fact, they estimated it was flying at about 1,400 miles per hour because as they watched, it quickly overtook their plane, flying at a slightly tilted angle. The next case occurred on June 1st, 1965, 7 p.m. A B-52 crew member and his friend were both working at the nuclear alert facility at the end of the runway, again at Bergstrom Field. They were standing on the patio when, as the B-52 crew member says, quote, all of a sudden, a shape started going from southwest to northeast. It was saucer-shaped with lighted porthole-type windows. It was so huge and going so slowly that I wondered how it could sustain flight. We looked at each other and shrugged our shoulders. We dared not say anything to each other, much less the higher-ups, because if nothing else, we could lose our top-secret clearance and hence our jobs. Can you imagine? What a shame. Here they are seeing something absolutely incredible, and they can't talk about it. This is the damage the cover-up is doing to all of us. And here's another amazing case, which occurred on January 2nd, 1980, as newsman Buddy Price and his wife were driving along Highway 290 between Bastrop and Giddings. Without any warning, both of them saw 2 objects moving well over, they estimate, 10,000 miles per hour across the sky, or faster. As Buddy says, I've never seen any plane that could travel that fast. This is something I definitely can't explain. I feel it was a UFO and was traveling much faster than any type of aircraft that any nation claims to have developed. Now he did learn that 1 year earlier in 1979, a man from Giddings was driving towards Bastrop in the same exact area when he also saw a UFO. At the time there were many flaring oil and gas wells in the area, and Buddy wonders if perhaps this is what was attracting UFOs. The next case occurred at 11 a.m. August 1st, 1988. A man was outside his home in the backyard in the woods. This is located about 5 miles north of Bastrop. He had his BB pistol, and this is when he saw a metallic sphere-shaped object. It was traveling slowly, maybe 5 miles per hour, and very low, about 10 feet above the tree line. But it was moving steadily. It looked like it was under power and controlled, not drifting on the wind. And he says it approached about 40 feet away from the witness. So he decided to lift up his pistol and open fire on it, which he did. He thought he could hit it. As he says, I shot at it several times, and then observed it as it went out of sight beyond the trees in the front yard. He's not sure if he hit it or not, but as it moved off, it just went on its way. And as he says, I have relived this event many times, wondering just what it was that I observed. I have never observed another unexplained object since that time or before. The case from Bastrop occurred on February 19. The witness was driving north on Highway 20 about 5 miles south of the Highway 71 intersection in Bastrop when he saw a saucer-shaped object, which he said was moving very fast in a straight line from east to west. It looked to him kind of like a frying pan with no handle, slightly wider at the top than the bottom, and as he watched it would change from white to silver, pulsating, and at times becoming almost transparent. He watched it for about 30 seconds when suddenly it swooped upwards and into a small cloud. This was a very thin, small cloud. There were just a few other clouds in the sky. So he waited for it to come out of the cloud, but it never did. And as he watched, this cloud sort of broke up and dissolved, and of course, the object was gone. Here's another really interesting case, which occurred at 9 p.m. on July 12, 2014. An anonymous witness said that they saw a metallic cylindrical object about 20 to 25 feet wide with a light at each end, and as they watched it flew silently at a very low elevation, 200 feet, directly above the open field behind the Lowe's hardware store. And as the witness says in his own words, this cylinder was flying so fast, it was over the horizon in less than 10 seconds. I have never seen anything fly this fast as it ascended and gained altitude. I presume it had landed and was taking off. There were no propellers, rotors, wings, or jets. Although this sighting was only seconds long, I got a good look at it, and another man in a white SUV was staring with his mouth open in apparent near shock. Thanks again, the Coon. I really enjoyed learning about the sightings and encounters over Bastrop and Bergstrom Field. The Texas guy who shot his pistol at the UFO, that's in true Texas style. That was certainly interesting. I loved the case involving the gentleman who had top secret clearance, seeing a classic flying saucer zipping by their plane. Stuff like that. I mean, it's hard to deny that there's something truly going on here. So there you go. UFOs over your hometown. UFOs are visiting every place on this planet. And it's not just sightings. As we see, there's landings, there's face-to-face encounters with humanoids, there's onboard encounters. There is so much going on here. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm almost 100% positive that all of these locations have far, far more encounters than I've covered here. I know some do because I saw them. I didn't cover them because they're very simple sightings of anomalous lights. Not terribly interesting, don't add a whole lot to our knowledge, but they do show that every location on this planet is being visited. Said it before, but that's why I'm doing this episode, to prove this point. Skeptics really don't have a leg to stand on. They just haven't looked at the evidence. They have not done their research. No matter where you look, there is a long history of UFO encounters. So I will soon be doing episode 4. If you have a location, send it off to me in the notes on this video, or you can email me. My email is pretty easy to remember, prestonufo@gmail.com, and I will put it on my list. You'll have to be patient because, like I said, this list is over 300 locations. But I'm not giving up, and hopefully some of you guys can stump me. I don't think so, because so far I'm batting 100%. All right, thanks guys for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for the truth, keep asking those hard questions, and most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.